Hi, I'm Rod. I'm with Wisebond Epoxy, and I'm over here with Epoxy Mike, and we're going to answer some of your questions today. We get a lot of questions all the time about our epoxy, and we feel like we need to explain some things, get everybody on the same page. So, Mike, hit me.
All right, well, I guess we'll start with the most basic question here. We've got a bunch of different epoxies available. Can you tell us about each epoxy and what exactly they do?
Right, we've got a tabletop epoxy, which is a 1-gallon kit. It consists of 2 half-gallons. We've got the deep pour, that is a 2-to-1 ratio, and that's 1 gallon of the A side and a half-gallon of the B side. We have our quick set epoxy, which is 2 pints for a quart kit. The tabletop is just what it is. It's tabletop epoxy for a flood coat over a table. You can put it on countertops with colorants, mica powders, any kind of colorants make faux countertops and stuff. The deep pour is just that. It's a deep pour. It's not meant for floors. It's not meant for tabletops. So that's when you're making a river table or thick casting. Anything that you want to put like an object into is thick casting. So that is a tremendous product. And then again, when you're doing a river table, you're going to need our quick set epoxy. And that quick set seals the live edge, so then when you pour your deep pour, you don't get bubbles and off-gassing coming out of the live edge.
Of course. So even though we have different size jugs, different types of ratios for each epoxy, the mixing process is still pretty much the same. Can you go into depth about how to mix these products?
That's a real huge problem with a lot of people is mixing. With the tabletop, it's a more viscous, thicker epoxy. So when you're mixing it with a cordless drill, you can get a lot of air into it, and we have a lot of problems with that. So if you do, you're not making whipped cream. Go slow, scrape the edges of the bucket, and then pour your flood coat. And then you'll see bubbles too. So again, to take care of your bubbles on that, use a torch and quickly go over the epoxy, or even a hot air gun. Okay. But with deep pour, that's a little less viscous. It's a little more forgiving. And so any bubbles you mix into it during mixing should come out of it, and it should be crystal clear. So, and you're going to have a little bit of bubbles with the quick set on your live edge. Again, you can hit that with a torch or a heat gun or something like that.
So the torch. Do you have an idea of how long you should watch for bubbles, or?
Well, it depends on, like, let's talk about tabletop real fast. It's very important that you seal that wood or whatever substrate you're putting it on with, and we use our quick set as a seal coat. That will seal off any off-gassing that's coming out of that table, because it's going to happen. So when you pour your tabletop on top of that, you may see bubbles coming up out of that wood if you don't properly seal that wood prior to the tabletop. Again, with the deep pour, you know, if you seal those live edges, you should be fine.
Okay. So where do I mix epoxy? Where should I build my table? Where is the best place to build a river table and allow that to cure properly? Ambient temperature, humidity, those kind of things.
Yeah. We have a lot of customers that will do it in their garage. A lot of our customers are woodworkers themselves, so they've got really nice shops, or even danky old shops, dusty shops. So you can really do it about anywhere. This is very user-friendly, very low odor. So you know, the environment does make a difference. Dust is your enemy, so always make sure that you're taking care of dust issues before you're using epoxy anyway. But again, you can do it in your garage. A temperature range, we like to say, for the tabletop, don't go above 80 to 85 degrees ambient temperature. Now deep pour, that's another kind of different monster there. It all depends on mass. How big is the river? How long is the river, etc. The more epoxy you use, the hotter it'll get. The hotter the exotherm will be. So you may need to use fans above and below your frame. So keep it cool. We like to say 77 and below. So the more epoxy, the cooler you want your room or your work environment.
Okay, so and you kind of previously mentioned in this last question about different sizes of projects. So with the deep pour epoxy, approximately how deep should you pour this at one time?
2 inches is that's our safety net. We've poured many different size tables, you and I have here, and we've stretched the limits. If you're new to this, I'd say stick to 6, 8, 10 inches for a river. You know, if you're a pro, you might be able to go wider. Now again, thickness. Stick with the 2 inches or below. So that's your safety net there. Again, it's mass. cool the room, all that kind of thing. The wider your river, the longer your river, keep cooling that room down.
Okay, excellent. And so say I am pouring a table, then it's a little bit more than 2 inches. Could you explain how to layer epoxy?
Sure. Layering is, if you want to go above 2 inches, let's say you want to go 2.5 inches, let's stick with that 2-inch layer. So the deep pour will harden enough in 24 hours. It'll go through its exotherm in 24 hours. It'll harden enough that then that next day you can pour that other 1/2 inch or another inch on top of that, and it'll be fine. It'll bond just fine. Now if you go over, if your river is hard, let's say 2 or 3 days goes by before you get back to your project, lightly sand it with 220 or 320 on top of that river, and then pour your next layer. Wipe it off real good with acetone, clean up that dust and stuff from sanding, but then you can pour right over it and it should be crystal clear, and you're not going to see that.
A nice seamless bond.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a step back just a little bit here. We were talking about mixing previously. Could you kind of go into a pot life versus mixing time?
Yeah, that's really important. A pot life is what it is. It's when you mix your epoxy in a pot, how long does that epoxy stay usable before it starts thickening gel, right? So tabletop has a pot life of about 15 to 20 minutes. Now, it shouldn't be sitting in a pot that long. You should mix it. You should have your table ready. You should have everything ready. Get that epoxy and pour that out, right? So you don't want to go too long on that. Your work time for tabletop is probably 20 to 25 minutes, where you're spreading epoxy all around and you're getting your edges, you're wetting your edges. You do your roll over on the edges and you get your thickness right. Deep pour, again, that's going to be a 3-day cure anyway. Well, the tabletop's going to be a 24-hour cure, but the deep pour is going to be a 3-day cure. So it's a lot longer exotherm. It's slow, so your epoxy doesn't crack. It cuts down on the shrinkage. Epoxy is going to shrink with deep pour. It's just going from a liquid to a solid. That's why you get some shrinkage. And it might shrink maybe 1/8 of an inch, but again, the more mass, the more shrinkage you might have in some corners of your river. So always make your river table longer by 3 inches than you're finished, because you're going to have some shrinkage, so you can cut those off square. But as far as the pot life goes, you might have 2 hours, if not more, sitting in a bucket. But again, your work time on that is again maybe 3 to 4 hours because of the slow exotherm. So, but get that epoxy out of the bucket. There's no reason. Get some friends, get some helpers, everybody mix the same. And again, one really important thing that we tell our customers is, when you're mixing multiple buckets, multiple batches, dump each one into each one, mix those, keep mixing them, keep dumping into each other, mix those. So then you create a homogeneous mixture. It's like getting red paint. You're gonna take red paint buckets, you're going to mix them all together, so it's the same red paint all through the house. Same thing.
Excellent. All right, so I think we've kind of covered the mixing process and the different types of epoxy, but what really draws everyone's attention to river tables are the colorants.
Right.
So kind of go into the different types of colorants that we offer and what they do differently and similar to each other.
Sure. So we have 70 different mica powders, and that's what typically people are using for river tables. That mica powder is a particle, and it's a really small particle that when deep pour goes into its exotherm, you'll then see the billowing, right? And the billowing of the epoxy is what makes those particles of mica powder flow around. That's what creates billowing. People love that. Again, you can get into solid colors if you want to have a solid colored epoxy. We have alcohol inks, which will give you a translucent deep pour so you can see through. We've got color shifting, which really is kind of neat when it goes through that billowing. We have the glow in the dark and fluorescent too. So there's a lot of different colorants that we offer that they do different things, and depends on what your project is what what you're going to use for a colorant. Okay. And again, using colorants you can put into voids and cracks. You can fill them. You can put accents. So if you have like a little spider vein or crack or something that on a table, fill that in with some deep pour of a different color as an accent. to go with your different colored river table. It's kind of neat. A lot of people use black too for doing that.
Just to kind of hide it, of course. So you kind of talked about those cracks, alluded to those cracks there. Those kind of fall in an in-between of what epoxy to use. Do you have a suggestion on what to fill knots or cracks with?
Yeah, if you're in a hurry, you can use Kwikset, and you can mix colorants into that, and that'll cure in 3 hours, 4 hours. Tabletop will work fine too. Again, it's your schedule. So if you're making a river table, you can definitely use deep pour as well. And again, it depends on what project you're working on, what kind of project you're working on.
So we've got these projects, and a question that we get a lot, and I know that there's a lot of out there, is where can we place this? Can we put an epoxy project outdoors? And if we do, what should we expect?
Right. All epoxy is going to yellow, and it just depends on where you put it. We always tell everybody, keep it in the house, keep it out of direct sunlight. If you're doing a really nice river table that you put tabletop on, keep it inside. Keep it away from a window where there's going to be sun beating down on it. How long will it take to yellow? We don't know because it's so many variables, but we do have additives, a UV additive in all of these epoxies that help stabilize the epoxy and stave off that UV yellowing. We never suggest anybody put an epoxy project outside, but we have those people that do that. So ultimately what we tell them is cover it. So if you want to make a really nice bar or something that's outside or whatever, maybe you've got an awning you can keep it under, but put a blanket over it, cover it, take care of it, keep it out of the sun, take the blanket off or the cover off when you're going to use it, put it back on.
Okay,
so
excellent.
It can be done.
Okay, and so when we do these projects and we're kind of getting to that final coat with that bar and tabletop that you alluded to earlier, when should we sand? What should we be doing in terms of sanding to prepare this for that final coat?
As far as the tabletops?
Yes.
The tabletop is kind of a different animal as far as sanding goes, because when you're pouring a tabletop, you're going to be pouring a flood coat, right? And that'll be a clear flood coat, and it should be pretty perfect. Now, let's say you've got some imperfections. At the end of the day, you've got some waves or something like that, and you think, okay, I need to re-pour this. Or even if your epoxy, your flood coat is soft, maybe that's a mixing issue. Mixing, again, follow our directions. Everybody really needs to follow our directions on our website and on the jugs to know how to mix properly. If you don't get your mixing correct, the 1-to-1 ratio, the 2-to-1 ratio, the epoxy is going to be off. I mean, because it's a chemical reaction, it's that simple. So if you decide you need to pour another layer of tabletop, sand that lightly with 320 grit, sand it all real nice, wipe it down the best you can with acetone, and then you can pour right over that. And you'll have another crystal clear, top on that, and you're not going to see it. If you're using colorants, sometimes when you're laying colorants down with a tabletop, you're making a dirty pour or a faux granite or something like that, there may be imperfections, and you may want to then pour a clear coat on top of that. And that will smooth out any imperfections you might have had with the dirty pour or the faux top finish that you're trying to make on a countertop or a bar or a table or something, and that will smooth that off as well. Deep pour, again, if you're going to need to layer that, you want to sand that again with 320 before you do your other layering.
Put a little acetone to make sure it's nice and
clean
clean.
It up with acetone, because you will see, when you sand epoxy, you get those little white flakes around. If you've got a little bubble in the hardened epoxy, that sanded material will stick in there. Pick it out, blow it out, get it out of there. Otherwise, you're going to encapsulate that, and you'll see that little white speck. So be careful with that.
Yeah. Another popular method that a lot of people seem to be doing now are encapsulating projects, encapsulating things, whether they're photos or little trinkets.
Memorabilia or flowers or stuff metals they got from the Army or anything like that. And one thing that's really popular is gun shell casings. Never use live ammunition. We've had people that have done that, and you can use the shell. You can get a tumbler and walnut shells, and you can get a tumbler and tumble those for a nice brassy finish, and you can put those in deep pour epoxy, like in the bottom of a river table. People will make blocks. One guy that's a real good customer of ours, he makes Star Wars little blocks with really cool miniature figures and stuff like that, and it's a clear block. You can put pictures in it, but again, when you are encapsulating something, there's always going to be surface air on that object, right? So if you just pour your deep pour over it and stuff like that, there could be hidden and trapped air on the surface or in a crevice or something, so wet that object. If it's memorabilia, wet it. If you're doing flowers or leaves or something like that, dry them, right? Because you don't want that moisture trapped in there. That moisture inside of an object will make your deep pour epoxy go haywire. But always wet your objects.
So Rob, what kind of safeguards should we take when dealing with epoxy?
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, it's a very safe product, but again, use protective eyewear, gloves all the time. Epoxy is going to stick to your hands. It's just gooey. Use any and all protective safeware that you're comfortable with. If you want to use a mask or a respirator, please do. We're not saying you should or shouldn't. We're just saying make sure you protect yourself in every manner possible that you're comfortable with.
Excellent. So when we are adding epoxy or adding colorant into the epoxy, do you have a rough estimate of how much colorant I should be adding into my pour?
You know, one of the big problems is everybody says, you know, how much color should I use? Well, we don't know. It's not an exact science. The only thing we can tell you is 15 grams of powdered colorant per 3 gallons of deep pour gives a very nice billowing effect and a thickness that's all the way through with the billowing. But always, no matter what colorant you're using, mix a little first. Take a clear plastic cup, like a little, you know, dental cup or whatever, dip it into your liquid epoxy and hold it up and look at that. That's going to give you your color, the best range of color that you're going to get. But again, there's no direct formula. We have a formula on our website that you can see the different, how many drops of our alcohol ink will give you a different, you know, density. We have calculators on our website. A lot of people ask, you know, how much epoxy do I need? Well, we've got calculators for deep pour and calculator for the tabletop. It's on our website. Go there, plug in your sizes, and it'll tell you how much epoxy you're going to need.
Very easy. So with the tabletop epoxy, the most popular application would be redoing your countertops. So say if you decided to redo your countertops with bar and tabletop epoxy, what should you expect in terms of heat resistancy and durability?
Yeah, so epoxy is no different than any countertop surface that's out there. The most times people will ask us, well, what's the heat resistancy? Well, I ask, what are you putting on your counter, your epoxy counter, that you would or wouldn't put on a granite countertop or a Formica countertop or whatever? Protect it. Use hot pads. Now ours is rated up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit before there's deflection, which means there's going to be a little warp or an indent. That's a hot coffee cup. But use a coaster, use hot pads, protect it the same way you would protect anything. And if anybody says that they need anything over that, we question, you know, what's your project going to be? Why do you need 600 degree epoxy? And you're really pushing the bounds on that.
And another misconception that we get a lot too, is epoxy food safe?
Yeah, right. No, food epoxy is not safe. Food safe. It's safe to have incidental contact with food, meaning put an apple on it, put your sandwich on it, eat it, whatever. But food safe and food grade are two different things. Food grade is in the medical industry, it's in the restaurant industry, and it's a very small, thin, very specific epoxy they use to coat items, tools, table, you know, steel, even stainless steel tabletops. So is it food safe? Yes, for incidental touch. You're not going to eat your scrambled eggs off of them, but it's safe. So, you know, that's kind of the long and short of that. I could get a lot deeper.
Of course. So in an ideal world, we mix this epoxy, we pour it, everything turns out great. We know sometimes that's not the case. So let's go over some of the issues that you may experience if you miss a step and kind of see where it went wrong and how we can rectify it and make sure that we don't do it. So say I mix my epoxy and it just starts smoking, it smolders, and it heats up right away. What went wrong and what can I do to fix that?
Right. Well, first of all, again, going back to our mixing instructions, stick with those. If your epoxy smokes, you let it sit in the cup too long. You know, again, going back to getting your project ready, getting all your tools out, getting everything prepped and ready. So when you're mixing, you're ready to pour. You know, again, you get some helpers. If you've got multiple cups of different colorants, get everybody around and pour it. If it's just you, pour it, still pour it. But if it smokes in the bucket, you've let it sit too long. That is extending the pot life, and then the epoxy is doing what it's supposed to do. It's going through its exotherm and it's curing. So, you know, you've got to get that application out there. You could have an issue if you mix it wrong. Typically, any of our problems that we get questions about it begins with mixing. How did you mix it? And that's where we find 99.9% of the issues is not following mixing directions.
So on the other hand, you have it cure way too quick and way too fast, and then you have some that just don't cure, and so they come to their table a week later and it's still jelly.
Exactly, and that's a mixing problem with deep pour. When a table cracks or a river cracks or doesn't harden, again, that's mixing problem. If a table cracks, it got too hot. A lot of times you'll see a crack on one part of the river but not the other. Well, that's because you didn't mix thoroughly. You got it when you mix epoxy. You'll see tails, little things that are spinning around. That's unmixed epoxy. Mix until those disappear. Scrape the edges. Pour into a clean bucket. Mix again. Your mixing and ratios being off will make epoxy crack a river table. Plus, if your room is too hot, you know, and if you're not cooling that table off, it wants to cure. It likes heat for that exotherm for that deep pour, so it's gonna do what it's meant to do. Just manage that.
Okay, so I've got my slabs. I'm ready to build the table. The form. Right. Why do I need to build a form to put my slabs in? How do I build a form?
Right. The best way to do to create and make a river table is to build a box, and we call it a form. And basically, you're going to use what we use is 3/4 inch cabinet grade plywood, so it's decent rigidity. So you'll build a frame, a box that's going to fit your slabs. So you've got your 2 slabs on the outside, and you're creating your river. You're going to get sheets of the plywood. You're going to cut them down. You're going to make your edges, probably your sides, maybe 3 to 4 inches tall. Again, depending on, you know, you don't want to make them the exact height or thickness of your slab. Go a little taller in case you got a little spillage or something like that. We have our tape, which is our epoxy release tape, and you cover that all sides of that inside of that form with the tape, and that will release the epoxy. Epoxy just doesn't stick to this tape. It releases really well. Then you can use that form over again as well. So you may have a few areas where you need to retape, but that's fine. But again, the tape is going to release. So you're building your box, you're using screws to screw it all in. We'll go even farther with our box building and our frame building, is where we'll use bathroom caulk, the white caulk you can get at a hardware store, and we'll put it in between the boards as the table. We'll put it in those gaps, right? We'll let that dry and set up, and then we'll go even farther and we'll use our Kwikset. We'll brush on Kwikset even on top of that, all the way around all the edges and the cracks on the inside, even with the tape, even with the bathroom caulking. That is our insurance policy, that where even as the manufacturer, you know, we don't want 10 gallons leaking out of a form and it's on the floor. Now, you know, anybody out there, you know, go that extra step, make that frame as waterproof as possible, because this will be like water, and it'll find a hole and it'll go through it. We've had countless people call us and ask us, what can I do? Well, unfortunately, you got to stop that leak, and there's really not a lot you can do to even stop a leak. I mean, there's not really anything you can do to plug it up because it's liquid, that area's wet, on and on.
Yeah. Well, Rod, that's all the questions I have today. I really thank you for coming and answering some questions for us, and better giving us knowledge of Wisebond epoxy.